Welcome, dear friends, to the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where winter has settled like a soft, white blanket over the cobblestone streets. Smoke curls gently from chimneys, mingling with the scent of pine and roasting chestnuts drifting from cheerful cottages. Carolers' voices rise and fall, carrying familiar tunes across the frosted lanes. Inside her warm sitting room, Miss Marple sits quietly by the hearth, knitting needles clicking, her sharp eyes watching the villagers as they go about their gentle evening routines. Tell me, if you could spend a winter's evening here, what would catch your attention first? The crackling fire, the twinkling decorations, or the secret whispers of neighbors? The church hall of St. Mary Mead was alive with merriment, the annual Holly Wreath festival in full swing. Villagers bustled from table to table, laughing over steaming cups of spice cider and sampling mince pies that glistened with golden crusts. Every surface was adorned with holly garlands, their glossy leaves catching the light of the tall brass chandeliers. Children darted between tables, their cheeks rosy from the cold outside, while elders exchanged gentle nods and knowing smiles. Yet, amidst the cheerful chatter and the scent of pine and pastry, a chill crept through the hall that no fire could warm. Near the far wall, beneath a massive holly wreath, lay the body of Mr. Samuel Withers, the village's beloved baker, his face pale and still. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and whispers spread like wildfire, but the constables seemed perplexed, unable to make sense of the scene. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the edge of the hall, noticed what others did not. A torn glove peeking from beneath a table, a faint aroma of almond that lingered unnaturally in the air, and a curious scuff mark near the wreath's base. Who among the cheerful crowd could conceal a secret so deadly? She wondered, and what had led to this shocking end? Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Holly. Even as the initial shock of Mr. Samuel Withers' untimely demise began to settle, the church hall of St. Mary Mead buzzed with a peculiar kind of energy, not the merry warmth of the Holly Wreath Festival, but the tense, low hum of speculation. Villagers leaned close to one another, voices dropped to confidential whispers, their eyes darting furtively toward anyone who might betray a hint of guilt. Old Mrs. Penrose, clutching her lace-edged handkerchief, shook her head repeatedly. "I never trusted that boy in the bakery," she murmured to Mrs. Clavering. "He always looked so surly. Mark my words, it was him." Across the room, young Miss Tibbs, with her cheeks still flushed from the cider, insisted that it must have been a rival baker from Marleycombe, surely motivated by jealousy or a desire to steal Samuel's secret recipes. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the shadow of a holly-adorned pillar, listened with her usual patience. She noted the contradictions with care. Mrs. Penrose claimed to have seen the boy near the hall at 7, yet he was known to be delivering bread across the village at that hour. Miss Tibbs insisted she saw a stranger lurking in the lane outside, though several others swore no one had passed by. The subtle inconsistencies did not escape Miss Marple's attention. She had learned long ago that human nature, especially when stirred by fear or curiosity, often betrayed more than it concealed. She watched Mr. Carter, the postman, wringing his hands while insisting that the police were too hasty, and Mrs. Garnett, who laughed nervously while suggesting that perhaps it was a long-standing feud that finally turned fatal. Every whisper, every sideways glance, and every half-formed accusation painted a tapestry of village life tinged with suspicion and hidden motives. The room, which only moments before had been filled with laughter and song, now seemed charged with an undercurrent of unease, the bright holly wreaths above mocking the darkness that had quietly crept beneath them. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes swept over the crowd with gentle scrutiny. Somewhere in this throng of murmurs and sideways glances lay the truth, carefully hidden beneath layers of fear, pride, and ordinary village charm. She only had to listen, observe, and wait for the subtle clues that would reveal what others were too hasty or too frightened to see. Miss Marple had scarcely set her teacup down when Mrs. Betsy Simmons, the village widow with a penchant for noticing everything and sharing little, sidled toward her chair. "Jane, do sit for a moment," she murmured, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I've been meaning to speak with you, and now, with Samuel gone, well, it seems more urgent than ever." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, inviting Mrs. Simmons to continue. The older woman perched on the edge of the armchair, wringing her hands, her eyes flitting toward the bustling hall outside. "I can't help but think certain people have been acting rather oddly of late. Mr. Garnet, for one, disappearing at all hours, and Mrs. Clavering, oh, she's always been proper, but lately whispering on the telephone when she thinks no one is listening. And then there's young Mr. Haversham. He took a sudden trip to London just last week. Very abrupt, very mysterious." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles idly clicking together as she catalogued the small but telling details. Each observation, seemingly trivial, was a thread that might lead to the larger picture. The missing key Mrs. Simmons had mentioned earlier, one that unlocked the back storeroom at the bakery, was still unaccounted for. A whispered conversation could easily be dismissed as ordinary gossip, yet patterns often revealed themselves when no one was paying attention. Mrs. Simmons leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I do hope you don't think me fanciful, Jane, but these little oddities, they prick at one's sense of propriety, don't they? And now, with Samuel," her voice faltered, and she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "You're quite right, Betsy. It is often the smallest details, the key that vanishes, the phone call whispered just out of reach, the sudden journey, that tell us far more than the grand gestures. And we must watch closely, very closely." The widow sighed, feeling a measure of relief in confiding her observations to someone who would take them seriously. Miss Marple, meanwhile, let the information settle in her mind like a careful mosaic. Every incongruity, every unusual action would need to be observed, compared, and understood. In her quiet, deliberate way, she was already beginning to see patterns forming in the seemingly ordinary lives of her neighbors, patterns that might, in time, reveal the truth hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's festive facade. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered back to her frequent visits to Mr. Samuel Wither's bakery, recalling the peculiar habits that had always set him slightly apart from the other villagers. He was, outwardly, the kindest of men, generous with his bread and quick to greet anyone who entered his shop. Yet beneath that genial exterior were small, almost imperceptible habits that had always piqued her curiosity. He had always been fastidious about the flower store, locking it even when no one was near. A careless glance toward the rows of sacks would earn an admonishing frown, as though some invisible threat lurked among the grains. Miss Marple remembered noticing the slight tension in his shoulders whenever he passed the church's vestry on his way to deliver fresh loaves. And there were villagers he seemed to avoid altogether. Mr. Garnet, the local grocer, and young Miss Clavering, whose keen eye seemed to make him nervous. These observations, trivial to most, now appeared more telling. Why the secrecy? Why the sudden flinches and guarded smiles? Miss Marple began to trace potential connections in her mind. Perhaps some old disagreement had festered beneath the surface, or a financial arrangement gone sour. Maybe the baker had known more than he should, or perhaps he had stumbled upon a secret best left undisturbed. Each small quirk, locking the flower, sidestepping neighbors, uneasy glances, serve as a fragment of a larger puzzle. She also recalled a faint, recurring scent that lingered in the bakery, almond perhaps, or marzipan, lingering after he had baked. Combined with his nervous behavior and his habit of keeping certain areas strictly private, it suggested a man careful not to reveal what he knew or what he had done. Miss Marple settled further into her chair, knitting needles resting briefly in her lap. Slowly, a web of possible motives and concealed tensions began to take shape in her mind, intertwining personal rivalries, financial worries, and the everyday jealousies that so easily festered in a small village. If she paid careful attention to these odd habits, she could begin to discern a pattern that might illuminate not only why Mr. Withers had met his end, but also who among the villagers might have had a hand in it. Even in the warmth of the festival hall, she felt the chill of secrets waiting to be uncovered, hidden just beneath the cheerful surface. Miss Marple stepped lightly past the threshold of the church hall, her gaze sweeping the familiar space with careful precision. The hall, still echoing with the hushed murmurs of villagers, seemed unusually quiet now that the initial shock had settled into subdued curiosity. Holly garlands hung overhead, festooned with crimson ribbons, and a faint scent of pine and cider lingered in the air. It was a scene of festive charm, yet the underlying tension was palpable, a tension that only those who truly observed, like Miss Marple, could perceive. As she wandered closer to the far wall where Mr. Withers had been found, something small caught her eye. A scrap of fabric, patterned delicately with crimson and gold, lay partially hidden beneath a chair leg. Leaning slightly, she noticed a faint stain at its edge, blood, subtle but unmistakable against the intricate design. Most would have walked past, assuming it part of some decoration or a fragment of clothing dropped during the commotion. But Miss Marple, with her unhurried scrutiny, recognized it immediately as something more. The scrap spoke quietly, almost conspiratorially, hinting at a struggle, a hurried movement, or perhaps an attempt to conceal evidence. She considered the possibilities. Whose garment could it have been? How had it ended beneath the holly wreath, so carefully arranged above it? The police, eager to pin blame on the young baker's assistant, seemed unconcerned with such minute details. Their eyes were on the obvious, the outwardly suspicious, the convenient scapegoat. Miss Marple, however, understood that the truth rarely revealed itself in broad gestures. It whispered in scraps of fabric, faint scents, and fleeting expressions. Carefully, she tucked the fabric into a small envelope she carried in her handbag, making a mental note to revisit it later. Every piece of evidence, however small, could be a key to understanding the intricate puzzle of human motives. The villagers, oblivious, continued their quiet speculations, but for Miss Marple, the discovery confirmed what she had long suspected. Appearances in St. Mary Mead were often deceiving, and the cheerful facade of the Holly Wreath Festival hid more than a few secrets. With a calm yet resolute air, she stepped back from the wall, eyes lingering on the wreath above. In that moment, the first true thread of the mystery had fallen into her hands, setting her on a course separate from the hurried assumptions of the constable, and drawing her ever closer to uncovering the truth hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's festive veneer. Chapter 2. Shadows Over Seed Cake. Section 1. Invitations to Tea, 450 words. Miss Marple's visits were never hurried. The gentle clink of her teacup and the soft rustle of her skirts were familiar to the villagers of St. Mary Mead, who rarely suspected that her polite calls concealed a careful, deliberate investigation. This morning, she carried her wicker basket filled with warm seed cake and a small tin of her own blended tea, intending to offer it as a friendly gesture, though in truth it served a dual purpose. Her first stop was Mrs. Clavering's tidy cottage on the high street. The widow's eyes brightened at the sight of the basket. "Jane, how kind of you!" she exclaimed, ushering Miss Marple in. "Over fragrant tea and crumbly seed cake." Miss Marple asked casually about the previous week's activities, watching closely as Mrs. Clavering's responses wavered under the simplest of inquiries. "Oh, I was rather busy with church arrangements," she said vaguely, yet her hands fidgeted with the teacup saucer. A subtle shift of her gaze toward the window betrayed a nervous glance at the lane outside. Next, Miss Marple called upon Mr. Garnet, the local grocer whose flour-covered fingers had delivered bread for decades. Over a shared cup of steaming tea, she inquired about his trips into town. He mentioned errands to Marleycombe, yet Miss Marple recalled seeing him near the church vestry on the very afternoon of the festival. A small inconsistency, but a telling one. By mid-afternoon, she had visited 3 more households, each time observing slight contradictions, fleeting expressions, and the tiniest hints of tension. Mr. Haversham spoke of his recent trip to London as business-related, yet his sudden nervousness when mentioning Samuel's bakery caught her attention. Mrs. Simmons revealed she had overheard a conversation the night before the festival that seemed innocent enough, yet it lingered in Miss Marple's mind as curiously pointed. Each visit, conducted under the warm guise of friendship and generosity, allowed Miss Marple to gather fragments of information that no official inquiry could uncover. Villagers, eager to be polite and pleased by the unexpected tea, revealed more than they intended. With every slice of seed cake consumed and every sip of tea savored, Miss Marple quietly wove a web of observations, noting the interplay of fear, curiosity, and concealed motives. By the end of the afternoon, she had begun to map the subtle tensions that threaded through St. Mary Mead, readying herself for the next step in uncovering the truths hidden beneath its cheerful, snow-dusted streets. The evening air in St. Mary Mead had been unusually crisp, carrying the scent of frost and distant wood smoke, when Miss Marple's attention turned to the bakery once more. Though the festival had concluded and the villagers were retreating to the comfort of their cottages, something told her the night held secrets that daylight could not reveal. A neighbor, passing by on a routine errand, had mentioned seeing a stranger lingering near the bakery just hours before Mr. Wither's body was discovered. The description was vague, yet the detail troubled her. Strangers were rare in the village, and those who arrived late at night rarely did so without purpose. Miss Marple pictured the figure carefully, a man, or perhaps a young woman, moving hurriedly as if aware of being observed. She recalled the neighbor noting the person's muddy boots, suggesting a route across the frost-slicked lanes, or perhaps a hurried trek through the fields at the edge of the village. The cloak, dark and somewhat rumpled, had seemed oddly familiar, though the observer could not place it. But Miss Marple, with her keen memory for scents and sounds, added the lingering trace of cologne to the image, a refined aroma, slightly floral, that suggested the visitor was not entirely unfamiliar with St. Mary Mead's genteel expectations. She considered the timing. Who would be at the bakery at such an hour, and why? The flour store, so meticulously locked, had been untended, and the back entrance offered easy access to someone with ill intent. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, weaving the fragments together. The hurried steps, the muddy boots, the scent of cologne, each seemingly minor observation hinted at planning, urgency, and perhaps an awareness of the bakery's hidden vulnerabilities. Unlike the constable, who was eager to settle upon the assistant as the culprit, Miss Marple did not rush to conclusions. She understood that a stranger's presence, fleeting though it might appear, could illuminate motives that the villagers themselves had never suspected. With her usual patience, she made a note to revisit the bakery at dusk the following evening, intending to observe what the stranger might have disturbed, overlooked, or left behind. In her mind, the puzzle was beginning to take shape. The festival's cheerful facade, the body beneath the holly wreath, and now a mysterious visitor. All pieces of a tapestry that Miss Marple alone could hope to unravel. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the quiet of her sitting room. A small envelope of letters she had carefully collected from the bakery resting on her lap. She sorted through the neat stacks with her usual methodical patience, her sharp eyes scanning each envelope, each neat loop of handwriting, as though the letters themselves might speak. Most were routine: invoices from suppliers, courteous notes from neighbors thanking Samuel for his generosity, and reminders of upcoming deliveries. Ordinary correspondence, entirely innocent on the surface. Yet, tucked between the polite missives was one that caused Miss Marple to pause. The envelope bore no name or return address, and inside was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, the words written in a precise, slightly angular hand. Do not ignore what you know, or there will be consequences. The truth cannot remain hidden forever. The message was brief but charged with implication, and the tone carried a weight that suggested both menace and familiarity. Miss Marple held the letter between her fingers, inhaling faintly. There was a subtle scent, cologne, perhaps, or the lingering trace of ink warmed by a hand hurriedly folded over the paper. The implications were undeniable. Someone had reached out to Samuel Withers deliberately, with a warning meant to unsettle or coerce. Who could have possessed such knowledge of his movements or secrets? The ordinary invoices and polite notes now seemed to frame the letter, hinting at a contrast between everyday civility and concealed menace. She considered possible motives: blackmail, a long-standing rivalry, or betrayal among those who appeared friendly and trustworthy. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the small details she had already observed: the missing key to the flower store, whispered conversations, the hurried stranger near the bakery, and now this cryptic correspondence added another layer. Each element hinted at a web of relationships, obligations, and unspoken threats, all woven tightly into the fabric of village life. Setting the letters aside with careful deliberation, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Ordinary life in St. Mary Mead might seem peaceful, full of baking and gossip and gentle routines, but beneath the surface, the currents of fear, jealousy, and secret knowledge ran deep. And in those currents, she realized, lay the motive for a murder that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the threads. For Miss Marple, the puzzle was growing clearer, but the true challenge remained: to untangle the human hearts behind the words and uncover who among them had taken the ultimate step toward betrayal. As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to hum with a peculiar energy. Lanterns flickered along the cobblestone lanes, casting long shadows on the snow-dusted rooftops, while smoke spiraled from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of burning logs into the chilled evening air. Within cozy parlors and the snug corners of the local inn, villagers gathered in small clusters, eager to share their thoughts and, naturally, their speculations about the tragedy that had overshadowed the Holly Wreath Festival. Miss Marple, ever discreet, moved among these gatherings, listening with the patience of someone accustomed to reading people as one might read a familiar book. Conversations drifted from mundane details, the weather, the success of the festival, to whispered theories about the baker's death. I always said he trusted the wrong people, murmured Mrs. Penrose to a neighbor, nodding knowingly. That young assistant had motive, mark my words. Across the room, Mr. Garnet insisted that it must have been a business rivalry, while Miss Tibbs whispered rumors of some long-forgotten feud resurfacing at the worst possible time. The constable, a stout man with an air of procedural certainty, nodded at each claim, his satisfaction with the surface-level explanations apparent. Yet Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unhurried, detected a web of subtle inconsistencies. She noticed Mrs. Clavering adjusting a brooch she did not normally wear, the delicate pin catching the lamplight as her hands trembled slightly. Another villager, eager to recount their movements on the night of the festival, offered an account that subtly contradicted earlier statements she had overheard. And in quiet corners, fragments of conversation drifted to her ears, half-spoken warnings, mentions of a secret beneath the wreath, and references to a stranger seen near the church hall. Each small detail, so easily dismissed by others, added weight in Miss Marple's mind. Villagers, in their polite eagerness to appear informed, often revealed more than they intended. The missing brooch, the inconsistent alibis, the hushed whispers, all these elements converged like threads in a tapestry, forming a pattern of suspicion, fear, and hidden motives. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple had catalogued every observation, her thoughts quietly assembling the intricate puzzle of St. Mary Mead's social intricacies. Beneath the warmth of tea and the gentle flicker of candlelight, she discerned the shadows lurking within the village's charming facades, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that the truth about the Holly Wreath Festival's tragedy lay hidden, waiting for those astute enough to notice the discrepancies and secrets that ordinary eyes might miss. Chapter 3. The Maid in Custody. The morning after the Holly Wreath Festival brought a flurry of activity to St. Mary Mead, but not the cheerful kind that often accompanies winter festivities. Word spread quickly that the constable had taken action, and by mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the bakery, eyes wide with curiosity and speculation. The young baker's assistant, Jenny Miller, stood at the center of it all, pale and trembling, her hands folded nervously in front of her. The constable, firm and resolute, announced that she was under arrest, certain that jealousy over the late Mr. Wither's success, combined with her access to the bakery, made her the most likely culprit. Whispers rippled through the villagers like a cold wind. "Poor girl! I can't imagine she would do such a thing," murmured Mrs. Simmons, clutching her shawl. "She's always so kind and attentive." Yet others were not so sympathetic. Mr. Haversham shook his head, muttering that ambition and envy often lead to dangerous ends. Even those who had once been Jenny's friends paused, uncertain of where they stood. The tension was palpable, and Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, observed it all with quiet patience. She noted the constable's satisfaction, the way he presented the arrest as a neat solution, confident that the case could now be closed. But in Jenny's nervous glances, in the hesitant tremor of her voice, and in the faint way she shifted her weight from foot to foot, Miss Marple discerned unease that spoke not of guilt, but of bewilderment. Jenny's account of her evening at the festival, though interrupted by her distress, seemed consistent, yet the villagers' assumptions already painted a different story. Even in this moment of scandal, Miss Marple's mind catalogued the details others overlooked. The slight scuff on Jenny's shoe that did not match the scene of the crime, the way she had spoken of the stranger near the bakery, and the absence of any sign that she had handled the holly wreath itself. The juxtaposition of her innocence against the villagers' eager rush to judgment was striking. Beneath the shock and the gossip, Miss Marple sensed that the true story had yet to be revealed, and that it would require more than assumptions, gossip, and hurried arrest to uncover the truth hidden in St. Mary Mead's quiet streets. Even as the constable led Jenny away, the village seemed to hold its collective breath, uncertain, uneasy, and deeply aware that the mystery beneath the holly wreath was far from solved. Miss Marple, knitting needles clasped loosely in her lap, allowed the moment to settle before she began her careful and patient plan to observe, question, and, ultimately, reveal the truth. After the constable had taken Jenny Miller away, Miss Marple returned to the familiar comfort of her sitting room, the fire crackling softly as snowflakes brushed against the window panes. The village seemed quieter now, though the undercurrent of speculation lingered in the chilled air outside. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting set aside, and began to review the details of the previous day in her mind, tracing a careful timeline of events with a meticulous patience that had served her so well over the years. Jenny's alibi, while superficially plausible, revealed subtle gaps that the police had dismissed as trivial. She had claimed to be tidying the back storeroom after the festival. Yet Miss Marple remembered a neighbor mentioning that they had seen Jenny near the main hall at a moment that conflicted slightly with her story. Small details, like the time it would have taken to fetch supplies or return a dropped apron, were overlooked by those eager to resolve the case quickly. The constable's confidence had created a sense of closure for the villagers, but to Miss Marple, the rush to judgment was troubling. As she traced the day hour by hour, Miss Marple considered the other minor oddities she had noted. The stranger near the bakery, the scrap of patterned fabric beneath the holly wreath, and the cryptic letter Samuel Withers had received. None of these clues pointed to Jenny, yet they suggested a carefully concealed sequence of events that no one had yet pieced together. Miss Marple's mind moved through possibilities, weighing motives and opportunity with calm precision. She realized that the police had been misled by surface appearances and by the villagers' eager speculations. Jenny's nervous behavior, though alarming to some, could easily be explained by fear, confusion, or shock, emotions that any young person might display under the shadow of such a tragedy. There was nothing definitive tying her to the crime, nothing that could withstand careful scrutiny. Miss Marple's intuition, honed by years of observation and understanding of human nature, whispered that the arrest had been premature. The real story lay elsewhere, hidden beneath the layers of fear, gossip, and polite facades. With a quiet sigh, she resolved to continue her investigation on her own terms, carefully observing the village, noting contradictions, and patiently uncovering the truths that others were too hasty or too frightened to see. The puzzle was far from complete, but Miss Marple was determined to follow every thread, however subtle, until the picture emerged in full. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the bakery under the polite pretext of checking on supplies for the village tea gatherings. The crisp air of early winter nipped at her cheeks, but her thoughts were entirely absorbed by the task at hand. A careful, unobtrusive inspection of the place where Samuel Withers had spent so many of his hours. The bakery, ordinarily a place of warmth and bustling energy, now seemed eerily still, the scent of yeast and sugar faint but lingering. Miss Marple moved deliberately through the small space, her eyes noting every detail as she passed. The counters gleamed as if scrubbed clean, yet some cupboards were slightly ajar, revealing a surprising disorder within. Flour sacks had been shifted, small jars of spices stood out of alignment, and a few tins had scratches along their edges, as though someone had rifled through them in haste. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's experience told her that such irregularities were seldom accidental. She knelt briefly to examine the flour store. The lock, normally impeccable, showed faint signs of recent use. Could someone have been searching for a particular ingredient, or perhaps a hidden stash? Miss Marple allowed her fingers to brush over a slightly raised floorboard near the corner, noting the faint scuff marks at its edges. Small traces of spilled sugar and the telltale scent of almond lingered in the air, the same subtle aroma she had detected during her previous visits. These were the clues overlooked by the constable, who had been satisfied with Jenny's arrest and the surface evidence. Miss Marple cataloged the hidden spaces carefully. A loose panel behind the shelving, a tiny gap beneath the counter, and a shadowed corner behind the oven all suggested that the bakery had secrets tucked away, waiting for a discerning eye to uncover them. Whoever had tampered here had done so with care, leaving only faint traces that would escape notice without careful observation. Rising to her feet, Miss Marple straightened her coat and adjusted her scarf. The bakery, with its warm ovens and fragrant breads, was now also a scene of subtle intrigue. Amidst the disordered cupboards and displaced tins, she sensed threads of a puzzle that the authorities had missed. Small acts of tampering, a faint almond scent, and hidden spaces that suggested someone had manipulated the familiar rhythms of the bakery. For Miss Marple, these kitchen secrets were not mere curiosities. They were hints, delicate but deliberate, leading her toward a truth that still lay concealed beneath the cheerful facades of St. Mary Mead. Late in the afternoon, Miss Marple was visited by little Tommy Cartwright, a bright-eyed boy of 9 who often ran errands for the villagers and had an uncanny knack for noticing things adults overlooked. He approached her gently, shifting from foot to foot, his breath visible in the cold air of the sitting room. "Miss Marple," he whispered, leaning close, "I saw someone last night near the holly wreath at the church hall." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave him her full attention, encouraging him with a soft nod. "Tell me exactly what you saw, Tommy. Every detail matters." The boy's eyes widened, recalling the memory. "It was late, almost dark. I was bringing Father's lantern down the lane when I saw a figure crouched by the wreath. They were wearing a dark cloak and had muddy boots, and I think they smelled the flowers like cologne or perfume. But it wasn't Jenny. No, it was someone else." Miss Marple's brow lifted ever so slightly. The description immediately set her mind to work. A cloaked figure, moving cautiously near the holly wreath, muddy boots, and the faint floral scent. All these matched details she had observed or suspected in other strands of the mystery. But most importantly, the figure did not resemble Jenny, whose youthful frame and light clothing would have been unmistakable. The child's recollection introduced a new layer of doubt to the official story, one that reinforced her own suspicions about the premature arrest. "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked gently, keeping her tone calm to avoid frightening him. Tommy nodded quickly. "Yes, they seemed to be moving very carefully, like they didn't want anyone to see them. And they touched the wreath just for a moment, I think." Miss Marple thanked him warmly, offering a small biscuit from her tray, and sent him on his way, gently reminding him to be careful in the icy lanes. Alone, she sat quietly, reflecting on the significance of the confession. Every subtle detail, the cloak, the scent, the careful movement, was a thread that contradicted the narrative the authorities had constructed. The village, with all its polite facades and holiday cheer, hid more than one secret beneath its holly and pine. And now, thanks to Tommy's observation, Miss Marple had a crucial clue. The true figure by the wreath remained at large. The young assistant could not be guilty of what she had not done, and the real culprit was closer than anyone realized, moving carefully amid the oblivious villagers, leaving only whispers and traces behind. Chapter 4. Beneath the Green Garland. Miss Marple had long understood that beneath the calm exterior of St. Mary Mead, old grievances lingered like cobwebs in an abandoned corner. As she wandered past the frost-kissed gardens, she recalled whispered conversations and subtle gestures that hinted at grudges stretching back years. The village, so polite and orderly on the surface, was alive with small tensions, inheritance disputes, romantic jealousies, and rivalries that had simmered quietly, unnoticed by all but the most observant eye. Her thoughts drifted to the Withers family, whose prosperous bakery had recently expanded. She remembered Mr. Withers' brother, Edward, who had always felt overlooked, and the village ladies who whispered about old romantic entanglements, believing themselves entirely discreet. There was also the matter of the late Mrs. Hargreaves' estate, which had sparked months of subtle skirmishes among the villagers, each polite smile hiding a sharpened edge. Miss Marple paused beneath the ivy-draped wall of the churchyard, allowing the crisp air to clear her mind. She considered how these long-buried resentments might surface when combined with opportunity and desperation. A missing brooch here, a slanderous remark there. It was easy to see how a single spark could ignite a tragedy. Her sharp eyes scanned the rooftops and cobblestones, noting who lingered unusually close to the Withers bakery and who avoided it entirely. It was these tiny signals, often dismissed by others, that would ultimately illuminate the darker motives lurking beneath the village's charming facade. The church vestry was quiet, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows and casting long, golden shadows across the polished pews. Miss Marple had a way of moving silently, as though her presence went unnoticed even in the smallest corners of the village. It was there, tucked behind a loose panel of the vestry wall, that she discovered a bundle of old letters, yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though the author had feared discovery, and the envelopes were marked with familiar initials, some of the villagers she had long observed with gentle curiosity. As she carefully unfolded the letters, a pattern began to emerge. Some spoke in cryptic terms of debts owed and favors expected. Others hinted at more sinister arrangements, veiled threats, and subtle warnings to pay or else. One letter, in particular, mentioned a sum of money and an overdue delivery of baked goods, a detail so small it would likely escape notice, yet significant when paired with a neighbor's recent behavior. Miss Marple's mind worked like a well-worn puzzle. Each fragment of paper revealed a network of obligations and pressures that connected several families in the village. Secrets that had lain dormant for years were suddenly visible, like shadows illuminated by a lantern in the night. She folded the letters neatly and tucked them in her coat pocket, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. These scraps of correspondence, hidden in plain sight for decades, held more than mere gossip. They revealed leverage, resentment, and motive. Quietly, she resolved to watch the interactions in St. Mary Mead more closely, knowing that these old entanglements were far from harmless. The holly wreath hung in its usual place above the church's arched doorway, festive and bright, yet somehow different to Miss Marple's discerning eye. Something about it tugged at her curiosity, an irregularity that most villagers would have dismissed as the natural settling of decorations. She approached slowly, her fingers brushing against the glossy leaves, noting their slight displacement, as if someone had disturbed them in haste. It was the ribbon that first drew her attention, frayed at the edges, slightly twisted, and with a faint smear that looked suspiciously like soot or dirt. Miss Marple crouched, tilting her head to observe the back of the wall, where a tiny mark suggested a concealed hook or latch. She traced it carefully with her fingertip, discovering a narrow compartment, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look. The hidden recess held a folded piece of paper and a small trinket, a brooch perhaps, or a charm, that had been tucked away, deliberately concealed. Her eyes, sharp as ever, noticed more than just physical evidence. The wreath's positioning, The subtle unevenness of the berries, and even the faint smell of almonds lingering among the pine hinted at careful planning, a deliberate effort to obscure something from the casual observer. Miss Marple straightened, allowing herself a small, satisfied smile. The holly wreath, a symbol of festive cheer to most, had quietly betrayed secrets of its own. With each subtle detail she observed, the threads of the mystery became clearer, connecting the outwardly cheerful decorations with hidden motives and actions that no one else had yet suspected. The church hall hummed with the warm, uneven tones of the village choir, voices rising and falling in familiar melodies. Miss Marple settled quietly in the back pew, knitting needles idly clicking as she let her eyes wander. The scene was cozy, almost serene, yet her attention was never truly on the music. Instead, she listened to the undercurrent of whispered exchanges, the murmured corrections, the tiny sighs and stifled laughs that revealed far more than the songs themselves. A fragment of conversation caught her ear. "I told him it must never be discovered," a hushed voice muttered. Miss Marple's gaze subtly swept the room, noting who had spoken and who had stiffened at the words. Another snippet floated across the air. "You're careful, too careful," almost as if a nervous glance toward the holly wreath seemed involuntary. Her mind ticked over each clue like gears in a clock, connecting the voices, the glances, the hesitations. She observed a pair of villagers rehearsing the alto section, one repeatedly dropping their eyes, fidgeting with the sheet music, their foot tapping unevenly. Miss Marple noted the small, telling signs, the subtle tension in posture, the half-smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, the way a hand lingered near the pocket where letters or trinkets might be hidden. By the end of rehearsal, she had mentally charted a network of suspicion, linking murmured threats, nervous glances, and hushed confessions to a pattern invisible to anyone else. The choir sang on, unaware that within their midst, the true threads of deceit were being quietly unraveled by one remarkably observant woman. Chapter 5. The Mistletoe Twist. The church hall, still decorated with lingering holly and twinkling fairy lights, was alive with the soft hum of preparation for the upcoming Christmas concert. Villagers moved about, arranging chairs and tuning instruments, their faces glowing with excitement, or so it seemed. Miss Marple, quietly observing from a corner, noticed the subtle undercurrents of tension, a hastily dropped sheet of music, hurried footsteps, and furtive glances that betrayed unease beneath the festive cheer. Then came the sudden cry, a sharp, piercing sound that sliced through the comfortable chatter. A young villager, bending to retrieve a misplaced candle, had slipped near the altar and fallen, landing with a jarring thud. Panic spread immediately. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices raised in alarm, and someone dashed to fetch water while another hurried to summon the vicar. Miss Marple moved calmly toward the scene, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The angle of the fall, the scuff marks on the polished floor, the slightly displaced rug. It was all too precise to be mere accident. Yet the villagers, shaken and anxious, focused only on the immediate danger, oblivious to the subtle cues that whispered of deliberate interference. She knelt beside the young victim, offering a quiet word of reassurance, and observed the reactions around her. Faces pale, hands wringing, hearts racing, an emotional tapestry that revealed more than any spoken word. In the midst of panic, Miss Marple noted who lingered too long near the scene and who slipped away, their movements betraying a mix of fear and calculated avoidance. It was a telling moment, a near tragedy disguised as an accident, a puzzle piece dropped in plain sight, awaiting the right observer to understand its significance. After the commotion of the fall had subsided, Miss Marple lingered in the church hall, her eyes sweeping over the scattered scene. Amidst the overturned chairs and hastily abandoned music sheets, subtle details caught her attention, details that would elude anyone focused solely on the accident. A crimson scarf lay half-hidden beneath a pew, its fringe slightly snagged on the polished floor. She noted its fabric, fine yet slightly worn, and the faint scent of lavender that clung to it, distinct from the floral arrangements nearby. Footprints marred the otherwise immaculate wooden floor. They were small, precise, and oddly positioned, as though someone had crept about, careful to avoid detection. The impressions seemed to lead from the vestry toward the altar and then veer toward the rear exit, a path too deliberate to be mere coincidence. Miss Marple crouched to examine them, comparing the angles and pressure marks, mentally reconstructing the steps that had produced such evidence. Near the foot of the pulpit, a small brass key gleamed where it had slipped from someone's pocket or hand. Its presence was innocuous at first glance, yet the location, just beneath the choir's sheet music stand, spoke volumes about hurried movement and possibly intentional distraction. While the villagers discussed the accident, blaming slippery rugs and inattentiveness, Miss Marple silently began connecting these disparate clues. The scarf, the footprints, the key, they were not random. Each was a thread in a tapestry of hidden actions, subtle gestures, and concealed intent. Where others saw chaos, she saw a carefully disguised pattern, one that would soon reveal the unseen hand guiding the evening's unsettling events. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft, indigo blanket, and Miss Marple found herself walking the familiar lanes, visiting the homes of several villagers under the pretense of polite inquiry. Each visit was accompanied by tea, biscuits, and gentle conversation. Yet beneath the surface, she was carefully observing, listening, and noting the subtle cues that others overlooked. Every fidget, every hesitation, every overly casual glance could betray a hidden thought. At Mrs. Pritchard's cottage, a seemingly innocent remark about the choir rehearsal contradicted the timeline Miss Marple had pieced together. "Oh, I was there the whole evening," Mrs. Pritchard insisted, but her fingers twisted the hem of her apron in a nervous rhythm. Later, Mr. Hawthorne spoke of slipping into the vestry just to fetch a music sheet, though his eyes darted toward the fireplace, betraying discomfort at being questioned. Even the youngest villagers revealed small inconsistencies. One casually mentioned seeing someone near the altar before the accident, then corrected themselves, claiming it must have been another person entirely. Miss Marple, however, remembered their exact words and the way their gaze flitted away, and she filed the discrepancy away as significant. Each conversation, each minor slip of the tongue, each contradiction became part of a growing mosaic. Where the villagers saw only polite curiosity, Miss Marple perceived motive, anxiety, and subtle guilt. Piece by piece, the tangled web of interactions and intentions revealed itself. By the time she returned home, she had refined her list of potential culprits and had a clearer sense of which threads might unravel the mystery entirely. As the chill of early evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat quietly by her kitchen window, steaming teacup in hand, reflecting on the day's observations. Her mind, as always, worked with the precision of a watchmaker, fitting together tiny fragments of behavior into a coherent pattern. It was then that a particular gesture, a subtle twitch of a hand and a furtive glance during the choir rehearsal, stirred a memory, a nearly identical mannerism she had once noticed during a village dispute years ago. The recognition was instantaneous. That same nervous habit had accompanied another deception, one that had remained hidden until circumstances forced it into the open. Miss Marple considered the villagers she had questioned that evening, replaying each conversation, each hesitation, each inadvertent slip of the tongue. One name began to stand out, not because of overt guilt, but because of the quiet, almost imperceptible way the individual moved through situations, how their eyes avoided certain details, how their laughter occasionally faltered under pressure. Her observation extended beyond words to the small, unconscious cues, the tension in shoulders, the way a foot tapped impatiently, the way the hands fumbled with objects when nervous. These were subtle signals that others would dismiss, yet they spoke volumes to Miss Marple. By the time she set down her teacup, she had mentally narrowed her circle of suspicion, eliminating those whose gestures and responses were consistent with innocence. The remaining individuals, she realized, were those whose patterns, reminiscent of past deceit, demanded closer scrutiny. A quiet smile curved her lips. The path to the truth was becoming unmistakably clear. Chapter 6. The Trap of Ivy Lane. Miss Marple's drawing room was warm with the glow of the fire, the scent of freshly baked scones mingling with the sharp aroma of pine boughs that adorned the mantel. The evening's plan was simple, at least on the surface, a casual gathering of villagers, ostensibly to admire the holiday decorations and enjoy tea and conversation. Yet beneath the polite facade, every detail had been carefully arranged to reveal more than casual merriment. Invitations had been sent to a select few, those whose behavior she wished to observe closely. Their arrivals were staggered, allowing her to notice reactions, gestures, and nuances in expression as each person entered. Miss Marple greeted each visitor with her customary warmth, offering a seat by the fire, a cup of tea, and a slice of her finest fruitcake. She asked light, seemingly inconsequential questions about the choir rehearsal, the accident, and the hidden letters, knowing each would elicit subtle clues. The villagers, unaware of the quiet experiment, chatted politely, yet cracks soon appeared in their carefully constructed facades. Some lingered too long near certain decorations. Others avoided certain topics entirely. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and calculating, missed nothing. Each glance, each shift of posture, each carefully worded reply became part of the tapestry she was weaving, a tapestry designed to provoke reactions without raising suspicion. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple quietly noted every slip, every flicker of discomfort, and every fleeting glance. In this seemingly innocent social gathering, she had set the stage for truth to reveal itself. All that remained was to observe patiently and let human nature take its inevitable course. As the villagers settled with their tea and mince pies, Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, fingers lightly tapping the rim of her cup. Her questions were casual, almost innocent, yet each was designed with precision, an artful nudge to reveal what people preferred to keep hidden. She spoke of the choir rehearsal, the accident, and the holly wreath, framing each topic as idle curiosity, while her keen eyes scanned for the slightest reaction. A comment about the misplaced scarf drew a faint, almost imperceptible shiver from one attendee. Miss Marple allowed a gentle smile to cross her face, as if the observation were unrelated to any wrongdoing, and continued her conversation with another villager. Each question was a thread, carefully woven to tug at the nerves of the guilty without alerting the innocent. Subtle slips began to appear, a hand nervously twisting a napkin, eyes darting toward the corner where the wreath had been examined, a slight hesitation before responding. Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions, the tightening of lips, a half-formed smile that betrayed tension, the quick exchange of glances between certain individuals. She never accused, never pressed overtly. Instead, she let the conversation flow naturally, letting human instinct and anxiety expose itself. With each gentle prompt, the guilty party's composure faltered, revealing cracks in a carefully constructed facade. By the time the teacups were emptied and the last slice of cake eaten, Miss Marple had collected enough subtle evidence to narrow her suspicion with greater confidence, knowing which hidden threads were about to unravel entirely. While the villagers conversed amiably, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the small, seemingly insignificant observers who went unnoticed by everyone else. In the corner of the room, little Lucy Hawthorne crouched behind the heavy drapery, her wide eyes silently taking in every movement, every whisper, every tremor of unease among the assembled guests. She held her favorite rag doll tightly, a shield against the adult world, yet her gaze betrayed a remarkable attentiveness. Not far from her, the baker's cat, a sleek gray creature named Whiskers, prowled between chairs and under tables, pausing to sniff at dropped crumbs and stray papers. The cat's movements were careful, deliberate, and, as Miss Marple knew from experience, often led it to places where secrets quietly lingered. Its keen observation complemented Lucy's innocent yet piercing gaze. Miss Marple watched as subtle events unfolded. A furtive glance exchanged between two adults, a hand lingering over a letter, a momentary stiffening near the holly wreath. The child and the cat mirrored what she had long suspected, following trails of tension and unease that the villagers themselves ignored. By the time tea was finished, Miss Marple had mentally logged each signal these hidden witnesses had observed. Lucy's whispered comments and Whiskers' curious pawing at a corner of the rug served as indirect confirmation, validating suspicions Miss Marple had gathered through careful questioning and subtle nudges. Even in a room filled with distractions, the smallest eyes and the quietest movements revealed truths that might otherwise have remained forever concealed. The warmth and cheer of Miss Marple's gathering belied the tension that had begun to ripple beneath the surface. One particular guest, previously composed and polite, now betrayed subtle signs of unease. Hands fidgeted incessantly with a teacup, twisting it in circles, picking at the rim, then setting it down too firmly. The eyes darted from face to face, avoiding direct contact, lingering instead on trivial details. A crack in the fireplace, the pattern of the rug, the placement of a chair. Anything to distract from the growing inner turmoil. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the quick inhalations, the occasional half-startled glance at the door, and the restless tapping of a foot against the polished floorboards. Every minor gesture reinforced what she had suspected. The nervousness was not mere social awkwardness. It was anxiety born of guilt. When a conversation turned back to the choir rehearsal and the recent mishaps in the church hall, the guest responses became shorter, more clipped, and hesitant. Words stumbled as if weighed by unseen pressure. A slight tremor in the voice betrayed the effort to maintain composure, while the hands, fingers flexing and curling, offered silent testimony to a mind preoccupied with concealment. Finally, under the pretext of fetching an object or attending to another matter, the guest rose abruptly, excusing themselves in a hurried, unnatural manner. Miss Marple's keen eye followed the retreating figure, noting the rapid pace and tense posture. In that moment, every subtle signal aligned. The fumbling hands, the evasive gaze, the rushed departure, and confirmed what she had already suspected. The true culprit could no longer hide behind polite civility. Chapter 7. The Holly Wreath Unveiled. The church hall, freshly swept and warmed by the late afternoon sun streaming through stained-glass windows, seemed impossibly calm compared to the undercurrents of tension Miss Marple had quietly observed. She had invited the key villagers back under the guise of a final festive gathering, yet everyone could sense an unusual gravity in her tone. The polished floorboards reflected the golden light, and the holly wreath still hung above the altar, a silent witness to past events. As the villagers assembled, Miss Marple welcomed each one with her customary gentle smile, offering seating near the front to ensure attentive observation. She began by casually recounting the evening of the choir rehearsal and the mishaps that had occurred, framing each moment as ordinary while subtly guiding attention to key details. Her voice was soft but precise, each word chosen to evoke memory without accusation. Then she suggested a small recreation of the events surrounding the holly wreath, asking volunteers to demonstrate where they had been in the time of the fall and the discovery of the hidden letters. Villagers moved about hesitantly, some shifting uncomfortably under her perceptive gaze. Miss Marple watched closely, noting who faltered, who hesitated, and who cast furtive glances at the familiar decorations. By guiding the villagers to physically retrace the evening's moments, she created a subtle stage where the truth could reveal itself. Patterns, previously invisible, became evident. The placement of objects, the direction of glances, the small, involuntary reactions, all of which brought the puzzle closer to resolution. In silence, she observed, knowing that the smallest gesture could illuminate the final piece of the mystery. Miss Marple's voice filled the church hall, calm and deliberate, as she began to outline the sequence of events that had unfolded beneath the holly wreath. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how much a carefully placed decoration can conceal, and how the smallest details, footprints, marks, and timing, can tell a story invisible to most eyes." The villagers leaned forward, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension rippling through them. She began with the footprints, pointing to the faint impressions near the altar. "Notice the angle and pressure here," she explained, indicating a hurried approach, someone moving with care not to disturb anything else. "Compare these to the prints by the vestry. They match, yet the paths diverge strangely, suggesting deliberate movement to mislead observation." Miss Marple then indicated a faint smudge on the back of the wall behind the wreath. "This mark," she continued, "is consistent with the placement and removal of a hidden compartment used to temporarily conceal the letters." The perpetrator relied on the assumption that no one would examine the decoration closely, especially on a festive evening. Finally, she addressed the timing. Each action was synchronized with the choir rehearsal, a moment when attention was elsewhere, giving the culprit a narrow window to act without immediate notice. The fall, the scattered items, the carefully disturbed objects, all were orchestrated to appear accidental, yet subtle inconsistencies reveal intent. Miss Marple paused, letting the weight of her observations sink in. Every villager could see it now. The careful planning, the deliberate movements, and the hidden details beneath the cheerful greenery. The holly wreath, once a mere decoration, had silently chronicled a crime for the perceptive eye to decipher. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the assembled villagers, her eyes calm yet sharp, as she began to unravel the tangled motives behind the crime. "Sometimes," she said gently, "what appears to be a minor grievance can grow into something far more dangerous when combined with opportunity and desire. In this case, the true motive was layered, subtle, and almost invisible to those who only see the surface." She explained how jealousy over a business deal had festered quietly for months. One villager, overlooked and undervalued, had watched as another prospered from the bakery's expansion and contracts that could have been shared. Every polite smile at the market and every casual comment during tea was underlain with envy. It was not envy alone. Miss Marple noted old romantic resentments, affairs and unfulfilled attachments that had left wounds still tender, resurfacing at the slightest provocation. The intertwining of these emotions had provided fertile ground for resentment and revenge, long masked beneath the village's veneer of civility. Finally, she revealed the role of hidden blackmail, discovered in the letters tucked behind the holly wreath. Threats, subtle manipulations, and financial pressures had bound several villagers into a web of secrecy and coercion, each action building upon the last. The interplay of jealousy, personal grudges, and blackmail created a perfect storm, motivating the deliberate staging of an accident that concealed both intent and opportunity. By the time Miss Marple finished, the villagers understood. This was not a simple quarrel, but a carefully orchestrated act driven by intertwined human weaknesses. The motive was now clear, and the pattern of deceit unmistakable. A hush fell over the church hall as Miss Marple's gaze settled on the individual whose nervous gestures had drawn her attention all along. "It seems," she said softly, "that the time has come for truth to speak for itself." The room remained silent, every villager holding their breath, sensing the gravity of the moment beneath the cheerful greenery of the holly wreath. The accused shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting from one face to another, hands fidgeting with the cuff of a sleeve. With a low, reluctant sigh, they admitted the crime, recounting in halting sentences the sequence of actions that had led to the fall, the hidden letters, and the staged accident. It was a confession colored by fear, remorse, and the weight of inevitability, yet delivered with the dignity of one who knew concealment was no longer possible. The police, called by Miss Marple earlier, entered quietly to finalize the arrest. Their presence was procedural, almost secondary to the revelation that had already taken place. Miss Marple, standing slightly to the side, allowed herself a subtle nod of satisfaction. She had never needed accolades or public recognition. The quiet observation, the patience, and the understanding of human nature had spoken louder than any formal authority. As the officers escorted the culprit away, the villagers exchanged glances, relief, surprise, and reflection mingling in their expressions. The holly wreath, once concealing deceit, now stood as a silent witness to justice. Miss Marple returned to her chair, offering a gentle smile, knowing that the village could begin to heal, the tangled threads of jealousy and secrecy finally untangled by a discerning eye and a quiet mind. Chapter 8. Fireside Reflections. Winter's chill had begun to lift from St. Mary Mead, and the village slowly exhaled, settling back into its familiar rhythms. The bakery reopened, its windows fogged with warmth and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and pastries spilling into the crisp air. Villagers stopped to greet one another, their conversations lighter, laughter gradually replacing the hushed tones that had lingered since the unsettling events. The church hall, once the scene of intrigue and tension, was cleaned and refreshed. Polished pews reflected the soft candlelight, and the holly wreath, now carefully rehung, seemed less a witness to secrets than a symbol of seasonal cheer. Chairs were rearranged for comfort, the choir resumed rehearsals, and the decorations restored a sense of normalcy that had been conspicuously absent. Even the smallest routines, morning walks along frost-covered lanes, evening tea with neighbors, and the exchanging of simple greetings, felt renewed. Miss Marple noticed these subtle changes as she wandered past familiar cottages, observing smiles and the occasional playful teasing that had returned to the market square. Though the events of the past weeks had left their mark, life in the village had begun to knit itself back together. There was relief in returning to the ordinary, in the steady rhythm of daily chores, and in the reassurance that the village could once again enjoy its simple pleasures. Beneath the surface, however, a quiet vigilance lingered, a reminder that even the most charming facades could conceal unexpected truths. Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, the fire crackling warmly beside her, sending flickering shadows across the familiar patterns of her cozy sitting room. Outside, the frost glimmered on window panes, and the soft hush of winter seemed to encourage reflection. With a quiet sigh, she allowed herself a moment to consider the events that had unfolded in St. Mary Mead, her keen mind weaving together observations, human quirks, and the lessons hidden within the turmoil. Human nature, she thought, was a curious thing. Polite smiles often masked envy. Cheerful chatter could conceal resentment, and the most ordinary gestures might hide the sharpest of intentions. Gossip, while seemingly trivial, was both a mirror and a magnifying glass. It reflected the village's character while magnifying its smallest flaws into something far more consequential. Miss Marple had seen it countless times, the delicate balance between charm and deception, civility and cunning, that defined the rhythm of village life. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and considered the subtle courage it took for truth to emerge. Often, the smallest, quietest observations revealed more than overt investigations, and a patient attention to detail, combined with empathy, could unmask even the cleverest disguises of character. A gentle smile curved her lips. Life in St. Mary Mead would continue, with all its charm and occasional duplicity. Yet the village would carry forward a newfound understanding that beneath polite appearances, human nature was a tapestry of complexity, best approached with patience, insight, and an ever-watchful eye. In the days following the revelation, St. Mary Mead slowly regained its gentle rhythm, yet the villagers carried with them the weight of reflection. Over cups of tea at the bakery and along the quiet lanes, conversations shifted from casual gossip to thoughtful admissions. Many confessed, in hushed tones, that they had judged too quickly, their assumptions clouded by appearances and idle speculation. They had whispered theories, pointed fingers, and relied on surface impressions, overlooking the deeper truths Miss Marple had quietly discerned. The elder ladies, who often prided themselves on knowing every detail of village life, admitted that their eager curiosity had sometimes led them astray, inflating minor incidents into imagined dramas. The young men and women, too, acknowledged that their observations were colored by familiarity rather than insight, often missing subtleties that might have prevented fear or suspicion from taking root. Miss Marple, in her understated way, guided these reflections with gentle questions and discreet advice. She did not lecture or reproach. Instead, her subtle guidance encouraged the villagers to examine their own behavior, to consider empathy over assumption, and to recognize the consequences of misjudgment. By the end of the week, a new equilibrium settled over the village. There was a quiet acknowledgement of human fallibility, tempered by the reassurance that mistakes could be corrected with understanding and care. Thanks to Miss Marple's insight and patient observation, the community rediscovered balance, a harmony that blended politeness with perception, charm with discernment, and curiosity with caution. Snow fell gently over St. Mary Mead, settling in soft layers upon the cobblestone lanes, the rooftops of cottages, and the churchyard where the holly wreath still gleamed in the fading twilight. The village exhaled a collective sigh of calm. The air was crisp and fragrant with pine and chimney smoke and the familiar sounds of daily life. Footsteps crunching over frost, laughter drifting from the bakery, and church bells tolling softly in the distance. returned in peaceful rhythm. The holly wreaths, once witnesses to hidden schemes and subtle deceptions, now adorned doors and walls with untroubled cheer. Their glossy leaves and crimson berries caught the last rays of the sun, reflecting a serene beauty untouched by past intrigue. To the casual observer, all seemed perfectly ordinary, yet Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the quiet perfection of the village, vigilance remained, not a suspicion of evil, but a careful awareness of human nature's complexity. Villagers moved about with renewed warmth and civility, exchanging greetings and visiting neighbors with a gentle attentiveness. Children skated on the frozen pond, couples strolled along frosted lanes, and the scent of baked goods drifted through open windows, mingling with the winter air. Miss Marple, observing from her window with a steaming cup of tea in hand, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Life in St. Mary Mead had returned to its cozy rhythm, mysteries resolved and lessons learned. Yet the village remained quietly alert, a place where charm and cheer coexisted with the ever-present understanding that beneath every ordinary facade, extraordinary stories might still quietly unfold. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, a soft golden glow spilled from windows, illuminating the snow-dusted streets and glinting off the holly wreaths now free of secrets. Inside her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. Outside, the village exhaled a sigh of contentment. Life had returned to its gentle rhythms, the bakery once again bustling with cheerful chatter, the church hall polished and serene, and neighbors greeting one another with renewed warmth. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected on the events that had unfolded. So much of human nature, she thought, is concealed beneath the ordinary. A carefully turned phrase, a fleeting glance, or a slight hesitation can carry stories far greater than appearances suggest. Villagers had learned, sometimes painfully, that assumptions and gossip can mislead, that patience, observation, and a thoughtful eye reveal what is truly hidden. And yet, despite the revelations and resolutions, there remained a comforting constancy. The quiet lanes, the tinkling church bells, and the cozy rhythm of village life that endured, gently reminding all who live there that the extraordinary often hides in plain sight. To our listeners, we leave these questions. Which clue surprised you the most? Who did you suspect first and why? Would you have noticed the subtle signs and hidden threads that Miss Marple observed so quietly? Take a moment to reflect, share your thoughts in the comments, and relish the cozy charm of mysteries solved with patience, insight, and gentle observation. With a final sip of her tea, Miss Marple smiled softly. The village was safe, the secrets unveiled, and the lessons learned. But in St. Mary Mead, life remained quietly alert, ready for whatever story might next unfold.